You're listening to the 39th broadcast of TBR Radio's, the TBR History Hour, with your host, TBR contributing editor, Dr. Edward DeVries. On today's show, Dr. Ed continues last week's conversation with TBR executive editor, Paul Angel, about the September-October issue of the Barnes Review magazine.
And let me say, as far as just from a graphic perspective, you found some really good artwork of Jeb Stuart for this article. What was it? Because you basically took my book on Jeb Stuart, The Christian Testimony of Major General Jeb Stuart, and basically condensed it into an article. So what was it about that book, perhaps, that made you decide that that was what you wanted to be the Stuart article? And what was it about General Stuart himself that, made you decide that he needed to make this issue?
Well, one was a unique approach to Jeb Stuart, as you had done in your book. And that was to just show what a Christian he was. I mean, this was a driving part of people's lives. And by the way, I looked at it, and Lee was super religious, right? And so was Jackson. And these guys, and this was Christianity 150 or 170 years ago, whatever it is now. And I just like it. I don't think they could have carried on. I mean, war is bad enough, but if you don't have this type of faith in something else besides yourself. So it was just the Christianity of the Southerners that I looked at for this article in relationship to Jeb Stuart. But just as I kept coming across, and by the way, you'd also written a book called The Christian Testament of Robert E. Lee. And it was just how it was pervasive. I mean, Jeb Stuart ran into a fire to grab his Bible so it wouldn't get burned. And here's a man, just the way things were different. Here's a man who was away. He wrote to his wife, nearly every single day.
Every day that they were apart.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, we might send an email, yo, what's up? People with kids today will send, and some emoji, and that's about it. But these are like just the way these guys wrote too. And Jeb Stuart, the access that you had to the letters was fascinating. But the things that they had to say were just so much more intelligent and thoughtful. And again, I thought to myself at the end of this thing, because here's a guy who died young, had a family, had kids, probably didn't have to do what he had to do, always daring, leading the front of his men, great tactician, loyal, able to inspire his men, inspire people. This is the other thing these guys did. Lee and Jackson's not mentioned in this particular issue, but Lee and Jeb Stuart are just the inspiration. Obviously, their inspiration was divine as well, but they led men and inspired men and said great things and did great things, and they put their money where their mouth was. And so at the end of that, by the way, they took down the Jeb Stuart statue here in Richmond again, and that was another one we had to see either removed or torn down. I can't remember how they did it. Maybe they got it out of there legally. Lee still stands because there's a court case debating the land usage there. But I thought, well, let's take a look at Jeb Stuart. And you told me you had him. And I'm like, at the end of the article, I said the same thing. Wow, what a guy. Why are they pulling this guy's statue down? Let's get an honest history of Jeb Stuart from a different angle on this one, because there are tons of books on the tactics of Stuart and his personality and his raids and the things that he said. But this is just from a different, by the way, a different angle, being that it was a very devout man. But it also takes you back as a thread through all the other biographies as well. Different types of religious people. Thomas Jefferson and Jeb Stuart and Robert E. Lee weren't exactly the same types of Christians, but this country that they built and they fought for was made for and by, honestly, and probably works best as a Christian nation where people are at least somewhat spiritual. But it's the exact opposite today. So again, their world is completely different from our world. In a world you may never see, and a future textbook may not even mention Jeb Stuart, let alone mention that he was a Christian. Most of these rebs, by the way, came and afterward became quite prominent in the U.S. government. One of the examples we had, I thought as a sidebar, might have been Longstreet, who had a distinguished career afterwards in multiple positions in the government, also as a sheriff and such. But also then you look at John Mosby, who also became quite prominent. And these guys were valued assets of the United States of America. These ex soldiers, especially Confederate soldiers, well, the Union soldiers too. But you expect that they're going to get some lucrative jobs at the end. These were important things. These guys were looked upon as just heroes. They were heroes. It didn't matter to some degree. I guess there was always animosity, but like Northerners loved John Mosby. Northerners loved Lee. Northerners loved Jackson. I mean, they didn't love them more as much as they respect them, but they loved to read about them and hear about them, and they saw them as real American heroes. So anyway, that was a great piece.
Colonel Jeb Stuart IV, who was Jeb Stuart's grandson, had told me many years ago, and it's part of the reason why the Stuart family had asked me to write that book. Colonel Stuart told me, he said that young Southern boys were going to admire the heroes of the Confederacy. And there were people in the North who realized that they could not stop that. And so what they started doing was they started changing the narrative about certain Southern heroes. In other words, if these young Southern boys are going to be admirers of Stuart, if Stuart's going to be the hero of young Southern boys, let's make Stuart a different person than he really was so that they would have the wrong kind of hero, in other words. And so, for example, we think of Stuart, we think of the swashbuckling cavalier that was played by Errol Flynn in the movies. And that was nothing like General Stuart really was. Because again, even we talk about redefinition and, cultural suicide and whatever, cancel culture, whatever today, they were doing it in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s. They were even doing it in the 1870s and the 1880s and the 1890s.
That's a good point, Ed. That's a really good point.
You also talk about tributes. A lot of the Northern officers that thought that some of the Southern officers like Lee and Stuart were considerable men. They had a lot of respect for them. One of the Union generals who gave a great eulogy at Stuart's funeral, of course, it was after the fact. He waited till after the war to really go public with this. Although he did write a piece, I believe, for the New York Times that did appear during the war, shortly after Stuart's death, basically a tribute to Stuart, and that was General McClellan. General McClellan had a nervous breakdown during the 7 Days campaign, actually abandoned his command, left his army for several days without anyone in command at all. And I had written an article that I really was surprised made this issue. I was surprised it didn't get held over for a future issue, given the fact that this issue was primarily defending American heroes. But the 7 Days campaign, a lost opportunity for Southern victory. What made you decide to stick that article in this issue?
I thought it was interesting. We had stories on 2 Confederate officers. I thought that it was interesting that you, alone amongst any historical literature I've read on the Civil War, considered that such a momentous battle. Had that turned a different way, we might not be worrying about that battle turned a different way. We might not be worrying about tearing down Southern statues. Might have been 2 countries.
I say it just always amazed me, a battle that most history books don't even discuss. Again, there were so many opportunities there, and they were just failed opportunities.
Yeah, unfortunately, I was sad to see that our one of our heroes, Stonewall Jackson, was not performing up to snuff that battle. Yeah. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. He took a nap. He had orders to engage, and he decided to take a nap instead. So
I don't know what was going on there, but it was interesting, and I think it also points out that even our great heroes do make mistakes once in a while, and they're to be forgiven for it, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, even Stuart, was out of place at Gettysburg because he was out trying to raid a shoe factory and get some boots for his men. So.
Right. Hopefully, he would come back with more than just enough shoes for his men. But listen, and we are selling a book now. I think it's called Scapegoats, and it does talk about Longstreet. Did I say Longfellow? I hope I didn't say Longfellow.
No, you said Longstreet.
Longstreet was always blamed for the failure of Pickett's charge. When you're going through a battle after battle, grueling battle. I mean, can you make every decision properly? I'm not even sure it was his fault, by the way, because Pickett thought it was Lee's fault, and Lee didn't like Pickett.
Well, Longstreet did follow his orders that day. He just violently protested them before he did.
Well, they blamed this particular book alleges he was brought up on charges. But that being said, once again, I mean, Jackson took a nap at the wrong place at the wrong time. But then again, he did so many other things practically single-handedly. Well, at least he and his men. At Chancellorsville, for instance, that I'm not going to get involved. But I did think it was an interesting article, and it was intriguing, and it fitted in with our theme. That was a massive struggle. It was a massive struggle, and I imagine there were Christians on both sides, and Americans fighting Americans, and it's not a thing to be worshipped, but it was history. So I feel like it fit in pretty well right there.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
The next article was by Clint Lacey, and he talked about slavery in the words of slaves.
Yeah, Clint did an interview on this. People listen to. He did it with you, right? It's on www.barnesreview.com and our radio slider, or if you click on there, you'll be able to be taken to one of the images for one of the radio episodes. I think you can be taken to an archive. And so Clint had done some research on the words of slaves that have been taken, annotated, or transcribed after the war. As a group of people went around interviewing a lot of the slaves, and it was interesting. They were edited. There's large numbers of them in probably the Library of Congress, I think. And it was just surprising to see. Most of them thought life was okay, but their observations of the younger generation, and some of the illustration of the cakewalk, which I thought was an interesting point, that Southern masters weren't so brutal. The famous cakewalk picture, by the way, was slaves would walk down a line, and they would imitate the white people at a ball. And so they would overdo the bowing and all this other stuff. They thought this was so hilarious. And the winner of the dance, whoever did it the most outrageously, I suppose, the winning slave couple would get a really good cake. And the master was the one who would judge the competition. So it's like they had a sense of humor. They understood. But the words of slaves were interesting. Sometimes they say that this master taught me pretty good. After the war, I didn't have any food, and the people, and he wasn't a master anymore. But they would send out people to the neighborhoods, and of course slaves could come there, or they were former slaves, could come there to get food and provisions to help them through. And many of the former masters employed these people and treated them as human beings. So that was interesting, just to see that there wasn't quite as much animosity as you would expect from the former slaves themselves. And there's a lot of good quotes in there from a lot of. And one lady, I think, that was quoted in there became quite a famous teacher, and her husband was a teacher, became a professor, I believe. So there was opportunity there as well. And anyway, just an interesting lead into our discussion of slavery in that particular issue.
And then after that, there was an article by S.T. Patrick, and he basically says that the Black Lives Matter people basically started looking to tear down any statue of an old white man in funny-looking clothes, and one of those was, of course, Matthias Baldwin, who was actually an ardent abolitionist trying to free the slaves. Yeah,
and that's a short article, but it has a lot of information in there. I remember the statue of Baldwin, and on the plinth, we're all going to learn that word today, on the plinth is spray painted murderer and colonizer. Well, he wasn't a colonizer, and he wasn't a murderer. He was one of the greater abolitionists, and gave his fortune and his efforts, nearly lifelong attempt to see all slaves free. But the mob isn't too smart. As our politicians, so many of them aren't. Neither is the mob. and the mob was just going after whatever they saw as a symbol of really whiteness. And they pulled down Frederick Douglass too, but maybe poor old Frederick didn't go far enough for him and lead an armed uprising or create his own chop zone. But Baldwin was quite a guy, and just yet again, just indicative of the idiocy of the entire narrative, and that we're being fed now about systemic racism, I believe, is fraud. And I can give you multiple examples at another time, but
to skip down a couple of articles, Larry Elder had an article on the Arab slave trade, and of course, Larry Elder pastors. I believe he pastors one of the largest black churches in America, and of course, he's also a syndicated radio host and columnist, and probably one of the most prolific and well-known black men in the media.
Yeah, it's interesting. We know that there's a large number of black people who are very much in tune to the message coming out of Louis Farrakhan's Nation of Islam now. And unfortunately, part of that is we're the blue-eyed devils. But a lot of it is a new, almost mythos for black people. He motivates them. But it's interesting that he has a name like Farrakhan and Elijah Muhammad's and the Muslim names. And Larry always thought it was odd that black people wanted to adopt Muslim names when Muslims were in fact the worst slavers of black Africans in global history by far. So another kind of same thing is in the same vein as Matthias Baldwin article is the irony of the situation. And it all comes down to learning real life history, which we've had multiple articles in the Barnes Review on the Barbary slave trade. The Barbary slavers went into Central Africa, but they also went all the way to the Italian coast, Dalmatian coast. Even made their way to, I believe, Ireland, England, once to Iceland, possibly in a slaving raid. They were widespread. And it follows on the heels, precedes an article by Arthur Kemp on the Iran War, the Arab Congo War, where European powers decided to wipe out slavery. And that slave trade was being run for the most part by this time in the Congo, because the European powers had finally taken control of the Mediterranean from the Barbary corsairs. But that was just another example of white people trying to stamp out slavery. In this case, black troops fought with white troops against very powerful Arab armies of Central Africa, because they would also encourage local black tribes to fight with them. And they get enslave other blacks, and vice versa. It was crazy, and evidently it was quite barbaric in that era. One of the Force Publique was the Belgian Black Army. They were composed of willing native tribesmen in the area, and they'd give them weapons and all. One of the Belgian officers, I think it was Belgian, it might be British, but in this particular instance, it was probably a Belgian. And he said, "What's taking so long?" to his officers, "What's taking so long for these troops to get going? Where are they?" "You don't want to know where they are," the guy says. He says, "Well, sure I do." Well, he says, "Well, they haven't finished eating the defeated enemies and the wounded yet." So, like the guy said, "I don't believe you." And he goes back and he's like, "Oh my God, they chased them off, their own troops off, and there was like body parts all over the place." And you're like, "Oh my gosh." So it was still pretty rough and tumble, shall we say. And this was just white people risking their lives with black allies to stamp out slavery. So I thought it was interesting because, if this, and I say this so many times, but if the Civil War was all about slavery, then 350,000 Union soldiers either were wounded or killed or died of disease in the war trying to free the slaves. So just a little bit of history will teach you that for a long time, lots of white people have tried to stamp out slavery. And it's not like they can't be systemic racists if they're trying to stamp out slavery. And the thanks you get, of course, is no monuments to those people whatsoever, no recognition that this has happened. It doesn't fit in with the narrative that all white people want to inevitably enslave all brown people and yellow people and red people on the planet. If there was a blue people on the planet, we'd enslave them too, but that happened in the movie Avatar. So there you go.
The next article, and kind of goes back away from the issues of slavery and the war between the states and back into a more modern America now. Just, showing that our heroes, our national heroes whose memories are being desecrated, spans a long period of time. But that's the Charles Lindbergh article.
When Charles Lindbergh, that's right. Well, he was in there because, although I'm not sure any of his statues have been torn down, he's always been a particular hero of ours at the Barnes Review, and also has been a target of Jewish lobbyists, mostly because of his anti-war stance during World War II, but also his evaluation of German military and technological achievement. He felt like they had left alone, they would probably win World War II, and that we'd be losing a lot of men if we went over there and fought them. And he accepted some surprise award from Goering, I believe, and that got in the news. And before you knew it, this great American hero who had crossed the Atlantic and who did many great things in his life philanthropically, he and his wife, Anne Morrow, and just in the aviation industry and his involvement in other industries. And he was ended up becoming a civilian pilot, but he got involved in combat because FDR was so mad at him he wouldn't give him a commission. I think that's the story. But this, the idea that the San Diego airport was the Charles Lindbergh airport, it's gone back and forth, and I don't know again whether his reputation is being resuscitated now because taking an anti-war stance. I mean, you can't blame a guy for taking a traitor the minute the war started, and his kind of disbanded the American First Party and moved on to trying to war all those guys. But just to see the leader of the Anti-Defamation League out there, who for years and years has been trying to erase Lindbergh's name from everything they can find for being a virile anti-Semite. So he deserves to be in this issue. He's one of our great American heroes who has been vilified on multiple occasions trying to write his name out. And also, this particular article that doesn't talk. We've talked about Lindbergh before in other issues, but this one focuses more on the mistake Lindbergh made when he identified the three forces. I think it was three forces behind the war, pushing the United States into World War II and World War I. Probably the Banking Institute, the Jewish Zionist lobby were two of those, and I think the armaments makers may have been the third. And so for that, he was immediately just for politically incorrect speech. Which is now deemed hate speech. He was they attempted to relegate him to the ash bin of history. Kind of hard to do because he was beloved. So he's making a comeback, we hope, and he's in this issue to remind people about other guys who have taken it on the chin, who are truly should be considered American heroes.
Extra, read all about it. If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Do it today.
Extra, read all about it. Is an article that you've already made reference to, and that is Philadelphia's police chief and mayor, Frank Rizzo. To some people, he was the big hero who was fighting crime in his town, and to others, he was probably the secret leader of organized crime in his town. You got to admit that whatever was the case, Philadelphia streets were a lot cleaner when he was done with them.
He believed in law and order, and he saw these post-Martin Luther King assassination riots and the unrest in that era. And he would work with black community leaders and others who were against this looting and rioting. And the black leaders knew that their cities were being ruined by the lawlessness, and that just like today, where 81% of approximately African Americans in the inner city would prefer more police or the same police, but no defunding of police at all. They also supported people who would stop this lawlessness. The Black Panthers were running around, and there was people taking over public buildings and having sit-ins, which I guess is okay if you get it over with. The minute you start interfering with other people's lives and you've made your point already, then you're breaking the law. But Rizzo was famous for that, but he's also famous for resisting kind of a program of the era where they wanted to do what Obama and Biden wanted to do as far as changing the single-family house zoning in neighborhoods, so that in the middle of neighborhoods, if there was the space and they were deemed too racially homogenous, that lower rent housing or public housing could be built in the middle of these areas, I guess, to introduce the minority groups into a stable neighborhood. It's something that Rizzo did resist because he saw just the opposite, this would create mayhem in the suburbs. And you see this now. I mean, do you really want this shooting and mayhem? Who's going to determine who comes out, where they go? And, well, they should have the right to just come out on their own. Well, not if you're going to bring some of that gang violence outside. By the way, the suburbs today, I understand, in most of America are about 35% middle-class minorities anyway. So they're quite diverse and don't need any more diversification. And I think even black middle class and Asian middle class and Hispanic middle class and people from India middle class, right? And whatever other country, South American middle class, because you got a Cuban middle class, right? Would probably object to this concept as well. So Rizzo, like Trump today and other conservatives, I guess, resist these social changes as far as that goes, and just let things occur naturally. But he was a guy who'd lead on the front lines of his troops. If he was at a banquet and he had his cummerbund on, he'd have his nightstick in there, and then he'd go after the banquet, and they'd go out and try to stop rioting or looting or whatever they could do. And he wasn't one to sit back in the office and just get the reports. He wanted to be out there on the front lines with his guys.
Well, you mentioned President Trump. And the next article was actually written by the president or written for the president. How did that work? So do you just pick up the phone and call the White House and say, hey, I'm Paul Angel. I'm the executive editor of the Barnes Review, and I'd really like for President Trump to write an article for our next issue? Or does the president call you and say, hey, Paul, I know you've got one of the most prestigious magazines in America. I'd really like to write an article for you. How did
Obviously,
that work?
The president's beholden to us. Because we've given him most of his campaign slogans, including like the media is the enemy, right? And some of these others. But actually, this was Trump's executive order available just about anywhere. But I think that it was characterized and not really covered well in either the right or left-wing news. Especially on the left, it was, by the way, this was not only it's a portion of his executive order related to his executive order on protecting monuments, but this was talking about the creation of a national sculpture park, which they may or may not have been talking about, as you well know, because you were involved in such a project yourself, to have an area where statues, realistic statues, beautiful statues representing the different heroes in American history would be located. It was quite diverse. I mean, you had Tubman in there, and I think you had some black singer, maybe. You had an Indian. You had one Southern politician, Calhoun. I didn't see too many Southerners in there. But you had Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson. And you probably had... I'm drawing a blank here. Frederick Douglass, of course, and others like that. Were a place where you could just go and they'd be protected, where they couldn't be pulled down, and you could just stop and think. And see, this is what the left doesn't understand, the radical mobbish left, is that when you go up to a statue of, say, Robert E. Lee, you don't say, boy, I wish you'd run white. This is what they imagine white people would say. I probably said this before, but I wish you'd won that war so we could still have slavery, right? That's what they think white people are saying at the feet of statues. No, we go up there and we say, wow, that was great. I mean, did you free the slaves? You did free your slaves. You educated slaves, but you still had slaves. What a complicated history and interesting history you had. What a hero you are. Okay, so I don't care what they say. But other people might want to reflect differently if the truth is listed on there, what he did and how he did it. If it's a place where people can go think, okay, this is something that doesn't really happen nowadays. People aren't really thinking on the streets when they're throwing this stuff. They're not really thinking. They might be thinking how to plan their escape after looting, but they're not thinking when they're trying to light down federal courthouses. Now, they might be if they have a grand plan for revolution and other stuff, but it's a pretty lame attempt right now. It did get worse, much worse in the 70s, as you well know, with the bombings and the more of the violence and stuff. So we don't know exactly where this is going. But this was a place where people could actually contemplate American history in a nice setting and be protected. They were originally going to do it in D.C., I thought, but they might want to move it out of there, away. And it could be, if it has the number of monuments and the beautiful setting, that we could have a national sculptural garden for history. It could just be a wonderful attraction that people might really want to go to. On the other hand, it might be a target of the mob, so that'll have to be protected. But I thought it just sounded so wonderful. They gave the list of people that they wanted to do and what they were planning on. As I said, the left said, oh, this is a failure. Trump's a buffoon. He'll never get it done. Oh, and these people, like, who knows? Should Jefferson be in there? Washington be in there? Should Sam Houston be in there? Should Davy Crockett really be in there? Okay, well, hi, Harriet Tubman. She should be in there. We'll leave her in there. But all these old white people. But you know what? So what? This is what would be a place that hopefully no one could screw with, so to speak, for years, where people could go. And again, it could be one of the great American monuments, parks, national parks. I don't know how far away the statuary is, but it sounded gorgeous. And of course, one of the requirements was that it wouldn't be less ugly, shapeless blobs of plastic or whatever that, and then you just put at the bottom George Washington. This had to look like George Washington, and he had to be doing something. And I don't know, I find these things really beautiful, and it amazes me that we can make these really heavy things and mold bronze and melt it down. We've been doing it for thousands of years, I get it. But it's still something that many cultures never really achieved. So that in itself is just a statement about what we do. We create things. We don't destroy things. At least we try not to. During war, I can't say that because I'm such a foe of war. For the most part, we're always building. Western civilization is building, and others are trying to tear things down. Who are you going to root for? You're going to root for Trump, even those people who hate him? You're going to root for him to create this beautiful sculpture garden, or are you going to root for him to fail and not create something beautiful? I think we know which way we want to go.
The next article was by General Michael Flynn, and it was "Do
he
Not
too
Let
had
the
an
2% win."
favors there. But no, and his is also online, and I thought it was great. And it also is a tie together with this Christian thread, in that Flynn, as his message is a spiritual one about defending America. America's a great place. Don't let them tear it down. Don't let the 2% win, because it is a minor, vocal, but growing minority of whites and blacks and others. I guess they got the American Indians riled up, who want to Bolshevize things, who want to socialize things, who want to communize things, who want the central government to be running everything for us and make us dependent, a dependency state. But anyway, the message from Flynn is one everybody should read, because it's one of hope, and it's one of accomplishment, and it's one in pride in our past, as opposed to shame.
Welcome to the Christendom curriculum. Every parent who decides to homeschool wants to secure a great education for their child, while also saving time and money. But these days, many parents have another concern. They also want a homeschool curriculum without all the multiculturalist, politically correct diversity doctrine that's really little more than a thin disguise for an anti-Christian, anti-American, and anti-Western civilization bias. Now there is such a curriculum. The Christendom curriculum gives your children a complete education in Bible, history, literature, and more, focusing on the classic academic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic. The Christendom curriculum is the only Christian nationalist homeschool program you'll find. We're living in a time of tremendous historical and social change. Christians have the opportunity now to begin building the culture and civilization of the next 1,000 years and beyond. It's an exciting time to be alive. So if you want to help raise the next generation of culture warriors, if you want your children to grow up with a love for Christ's kingdom and for their own nation, while at the same time learning how to defend America and rebuild the West, the easy-to-use Christendom curriculum is for you.
You look at what's happening in the streets of America today. Or for that matter, you go back and you compare the American Revolution to the French Revolution, and they both happened, within a few years of each other. The American Revolution was not the violent, bloody, mob uprising, murderous mess that the French Revolution was. And what you're seeing in the streets in America today is not a revival of the American revolutionary spirit. You're seeing what could potentially be the beginnings of another French Revolution. TBR contributing editor Ronald Ray somewhat discusses that in his brief article, Civism or Slaughter.
Ron is very concerned about the situation that's going on right now, so it's a very passionate 2-page article, and it was based upon a book that he had read from a woman who had been imprisoned her family targeted, an aristocrat, by the mob, we'll say. And we know what happened there in the French Revolution. The people that took over and promised revolution, just as the Democrat Party might do today, they might say, okay, we got an office now. We don't need to worry about all this stuff again. And the mob might just rise up against them because their tribute payments didn't hold out, kneeling with your kente cloth on, refusing to admit Antifa exists, funding and praising Black Lives Matter, ignoring the riots, that type of stuff they thought were appeasement payments, tribute to the barbarians at the gates, right? And so anyway, the French Revolution does have quite a few parallels to this, and you know that the mob is already coming for some of their leaders. Ted Wheeler, right? He appeased, and now he had to move out of his condo in Portland because they lit the surrounding stores on fire and used the furniture from one looted store to create a bonfire, and and so he's moved. Well, of course he moved. He's not going to stay there. He can support the mob all he wants, but he has to do what everybody else does in that area. If it's going to be like that, you can't carry on business or walk down the street in peace with your children. Well, then he moved. Well, other people don't have the wherewithal or the freedom to pick up and move, and they're stuck down there with this mess that these people create. And eventually they do come for you. You know, even like lesbian people like Navratilova, the tennis player, who say, hey, wait a second, boys and girls shouldn't be competing in sports. Boys are bigger and stronger. It's just nature. Then they're being vilified and outed and taken to the figurative guillotine and being lobbed off because they're not lesbian enough, they're not pro-trans enough, or they're not transvestite enough, or whatever it may be. So, you know, the mob just keeps on demanding and demanding and demanding until you stop giving them the stupid stuff. If they actually have a point about something, well, then you want to address that. But they need to. But this is all disturbing the peace to me. I mean, yelling at people and Black Lives Matter and disrupting life in general. I guess we are spoiled here, but this is disturbing the peace. And there's a reason that we want. That's the reason why many people aren't going to be voting for the Democrats, because they see that this is an extension related to the problem of appeasement and just your desire to get into power at any cost. So French Revolution, yeah, I'd like an even longer article on the parallels, and I may have that for my next issue, November, December, between the rhetoric behind, the motivating message behind the people who allegedly threw off the aristocracy to take over France and rule. Of course, this happened again in 1871, right? Just about 100 years later with the Paris Commune, and we know how that ended up. That ended up like a massive chop zone. People were getting shot. They couldn't figure out how to feed anybody. They were tracking Christians down, ransacking churches. You know, you got to watch out. No, everybody, as I say, the four most dangerous words are, it can't happen here. Now, it's already happening here. I don't know how it stops necessarily until we stop it. How did it stop in the 60s and 70s? Well, inevitably, they began pushing the line as far as real insurrection, bombings and mass protests and on and on rioting and looting. And eventually, you got to put a stop to it, or the American public will vote for the ones who they think can stop that type and restore, put life back the way it was before everybody told us it sucked so bad.
The next article was kind of a continuation of the theme, and that is that the far left radicals behind the destruction of Minneapolis, the rioting, the looting, the arson, were condoned and encouraged by a new breed of Marxist politicians, you know, primarily Ilhan Omar kind of being their queen bee.
Well,
that was by John Frank.
There's more of this than you know. She might be the obvious symbol of this because she's different from us in color, and she's different from us in religion, and she's different from us in the way we view America. There's a lot more insidious politicians out there who've also been funded by movements that inevitably come from George Soros and other Hollywood types who fund these groups and don't really know what they're doing, just like the Americans and the elite and industry funded the French Revolution in its own way, and so did the Germans, thinking that was going to cause problems with Russia. But that being said, for Americans, it was all about profit. As Matt Johnson has pointed out many times, the Soviet state couldn't have survived without Western business and Western elite money and propaganda machine. Same thing here, coming from the same sources. So in this particular instance, I mentioned earlier, George Soros has found that he can manipulate local politics quite well with public prosecutors. And as you look around the country, they're popping up all over the place because most people don't think too much about when they vote for their local prosecutor. They might not even know what party they are when they go. If it's one of these ballots like North Carolina, one of my friends told me this year they're not putting on DRR. So you don't know who the Democrat and Republican are. If you get a lot of people to vote for, I'm not sure they do the voting at the same time anyway for city council and et cetera, et cetera. But for senators and everything else, you better have done your homework and know where they got their funding. So Soros got a guy in St. Louis. He got a network going up there in Minneapolis. Kim Fox is in Chicago. Kim Gardner's in Minneapolis. And she basically ran the previous was it governor out of Missouri? Excuse me. There's one in Missouri. It's the one that went after in St. Louis. Is that Kim Fox? Or is that no? Kim Fox is in New York. I can't remember. But anyway, there's a Gardner. There's a Fox. There's other ones all over the place. And what they do is then they'll be part and parcel of this problem of arresting rioters and looters and letting them go immediately. And if you don't know, if you say to yourself, I voted for that person, I didn't know they were anything like this. Well, this is what the importance of local politics is. Because if you see anything being funded by the Sunrise Movement, or you don't look up the money, where the money's coming to put these candidates up. Candidates in a little rinky-dink place that doesn't have much money, a county like mine, for instance, suddenly sees massive numbers of campaign signs and commercials. Then you want to know where that money's coming from and who is funding them, because these local prosecutors really have a great effect. I mean, it's probably they who decided whether or not, and attorney generals, by the way, state attorney generals, about who's going to be released from prison. Are we going to release criminals out on the streets at election time? Are we going to release rioters immediately back out that are fighting police on the street and demoralize police to the point where they just quit because they see the same people day after day after day that they've just seen light places on fire? And of course, the money then comes from Sunrise, not only from Soros, because he likes to diversify. He's got dozens, if not hundreds. I think there may be as many as he's involved in all of them. As many as like 148 to 150 left-wing organizations out there getting funding from Hollywood stars and other idiots that never ever see this because they're on the cliffs of Malibu in their 7,000 square foot mansion. And all of a sudden, these rioters are out, looters are out. Then all of a sudden, they're moving from city to city. And then you start to want to know how that's happening, who's funding the buses, who's funding them. Are they living off unemployment checks, these stupid coronavirus checks, right? Sometimes stupid, sometimes saving people's lives, but paying for them. Are we paying as taxpayers, paying for the destruction of cities that we don't even know about? Or is it money coming from people like Soros and others who are actually coordinating some of this stuff? I'm not saying Soros is sitting behind the scenes saying, now I want you to go from Minneapolis to New York. No, he's probably just funding the money. And then there's local people and others very active on social media and others who have developed a network and using a Marxist playbook. I mean, that's what BLM has said that they're based on. And Antifa, we know, is also pretty well organized to be able to go from spot to spot. So until they investigate all this stuff, we don't really know. The message of that article is just be aware who you're voting for and how people like Soros and other people, maybe even like Bill Gates for some of the nonprofits, the do-gooding organizations he has. Where's the money coming from in your local election? When you vote for city council and you vote for attorney general, those are important positions that can really direct your direct affairs on your life, directly affect your life as much as, say, the governor can. And our governor here is once again going nutty and said he's going to mandate the coronavirus and make it mandatory. He did say after it was proven to be safe, but I'm not exactly sure how long that's going to take.
Hello, I'm Tom Strain, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
The next article was by Chuck Baldwin, and it was how Lincoln destroyed
Washington's
Washington's
that was a flashback article that Chuck had written for us years ago, and basically the headline says it all. how Abraham Lincoln destroyed George Washington's America, how George Washington had a particular vision of how the United States should behave, not only domestically but internationally, and how Lincoln, on the other hand, was basically the architect of the modern-day police state. I think people know enough history to know, but there were some interesting things in there. He actually was lamenting that there's a President's Day, and there ought to be a day for Washington. We ought to go back to that, because lumping in his version was President's Days for all the presidents. I think it's really just reserved for Lincoln and Washington, but it may not be. It may just be, hey, let's celebrate all the old presidents in one day, good or bad, and poor George Washington should definitely have his own day, and it was the end thrust of the article, and he makes his point along the way with a good examples of the difference between the philosophies of Lincoln and Washington.
And the last article, well, I guess the last article technically was one that you had pieced together from my Dixie Heritage newsletter of basically call it the laundry list of monuments that have come down in the last several weeks. But the last actual article was by Mark Rowland, and it was Glass-Making Geniuses, and just, kind of shows how ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient India, ancient Central America, that they created things that even in our modern day, I don't think that artists and glaziers could duplicate.
And the article itself is just a statement about creation. As we say, we create, and some people destroy. And when you look at just something as simple as glass making, which you thought everybody would have, but the height that what we shoot for, and what we're always pushing technologically and artistically, to the point where we bring this, just the simple art of glass making to, in the ancient times, and specifically in the Romans here, because they were creating utilitarian objects like drinking vases or containers, whereas the others that we mentioned may have been involved in grinding lenses for telescopes, which is also interesting from India and Central America. But just the quest for beauty, and to see beautiful things torn down and ripped apart. But then what have we created, and what can we lose? And why don't people? And some do, but why don't we have this? What took us so long to catch up to what the Romans and Greeks were doing? What's the difference in culture now? Is that what we're really from? Is that what we represent? Yes, it is. Really, it's the creation of beautiful things, and always worried that and must guard against tearing these things down. The Jefferson Memorial is beautiful. Why rename it? Why change it? But anyway, one of the things in that particular article I thought was, it was. The photographs of it would do it justice more than the interior of our magazine is pretty much black and white. If you can go online and look at the Lycurgus Cup or Lycurgus Cup, I think it's Lycurgus, Lycurgus Cup that the Romans made, was absolutely amazing. It was just beautiful. And here these people were just shooting for an aesthetic that was indicative of Western man. But anyway, they could take garnet, and they could take glass, and they could take ground up silver and gold, to the point where the silver and gold were ground up into nanoparticles suspended in this, and fire this, and then have these crazy, unexpected light phenomenon happen when you pass light through the Lycurgus Cup. On one side it's green, you rotate it around, it looks ruby colored. It just was amazing. I mean, why spend all that time on that? Why do that? Just because that's just like what we do. That's what human beings, sophisticated, civilized human beings do. They create beautiful things, and they're always striving to create more beautiful things, unless they're derailed by some crazy ideology. And we've gone through this in our own past, and just say the building techniques from the Parthenon and to the Taj Mahal and to modern construction monuments, etc. But our buildings today even are relatively sterile compared to the ancient buildings and edifices of St. Peter's Basilica, the Eiffel Tower, and all the Gothic cathedrals and the beauty that we did. This thing was different now. We don't have the money to do that type of stuff. But it's just that we also moved in the realm from the great painters of the old days, from Giotto and, Delacroix and the Van Eyck and all the Dutch masters and the Italian masters and that. And then you went through a phase where in the modern era we had modern art, and I think I've mentioned it before, but the Crazy Stations of the Christ with the stripes that I may have been done by a Jewish painter, I'm not even sure, and just like, or a blob of stone that's supposed to be a reclining female, I mean, the stuff we made is Western man made in the caves, and 15, 25,000 years ago was better looking than some of this. So we do go through phases. We're in a phase that politically, socially, that reminds me of the 60s. And then we've kind of, I don't know what we're creating now as far as artwork goes, but it certainly isn't as, I don't know, refined and gorgeous as it once was. But still, we're creating things and painting things and building roads. It's a different thing, and bridges and airplanes and all this stuff that I don't even know whether or not they would have ever gotten around to making in some continents, no matter what had happened to them. So is Western civilization and our heroes worth saving? Well, yeah, there's a lot more to it than we could possibly discuss in this issue, and there's a lot more going on. But 144 pages with like not that much advertising in it, it's a great, this Defending American Heroes issue is just a great thing to buy for people and give to people and have on your shelf and read it. Whenever you start to wonder if maybe there's a reason or a good reason for tearing down a statue of, say, Andrew Jackson, you pick up that thing and you read about him and you're like, no, there is no good reason. There's no real good reason for tearing down any of the stuff. But it is all just symptomatic. But I will say this. We know that history is changing. We know that the internet is being controlled. We know this since if you think I sound like a conspiracy theorist, it's been proven. Breitbart says 96% of their traffic related to election news has been cut off by Google. We know Google won't allow new ads the last week of the election if there's some big sticker. We know that Facebook is censoring stuff from one point of view or another. And so we don't know where history is going to go. You can't talk about the Holocaust. You can't talk about Germany in World War II. You can't talk about war guilt in World War I. You can't talk about our alleged allies being bad. You can't talk about the crimes of, say, Israel. You can't talk about racial differences or what we have or haven't done over the generations in legislation to make the United States the fairest place you could possibly live. And so what that's all going to be written in the history books of tomorrow, I have no clue. I just know that what's in this issue is what you're going to want to teach your children.
Our art and our cultural icons and so forth, how they don't have the same creation and the same beauty that they had in generations past. I don't know if you're familiar with the comedian Steve Martin, or more particularly his work as a bluegrass musician. But he and his band, the Steep Canyon Rangers, they came out with a song a few years ago called Atheists Ain't Got No Songs. And basically the point is that religion for thousands of years inspired music and art and beauty. And what has atheism inspired? And so as we're getting away from God himself and the religion of our ancestors, is it any wonder that we have a current generation of protesters who can't paint a portrait or sculpt or create anything that somebody would actually want to look
Reading
at?
the Barnes Review is also taking a look at the books we sell, and no one can get like the necessary education to discuss things like this without doing some research. So where this might be an introduction to these subjects, people should read books about all this stuff and become quite familiar with our true history. One of the books I'm thinking about is that Naked Communist book. We have tons of books on communists, but what really needs to be done now is for someone to really analyze exactly where all this came from. And I think we know it's been the kids on the streets today were taught by the terrorists of yesterday. And so teaching history and finding out the motivations behind here, how to stop it legally and peacefully, why people don't speak up about it. And this has all happened before, is my point. I mean, all of it's happened before. The revolutions that we tried to unleash on, say, Iran, the Green Revolution, where people were communicating via Facebook and they were putting out messages and newspaper articles that may have been faked or were completely one-sided, reminds you of what is being done now when there's a riot because somebody puts out a social media post that a young black child has been shot, and the black child hasn't been shot. It's just been some other incident, but they get fired up. They don't check the facts. They don't know their history. They don't stop and think. And all of a sudden they're on the streets rioting and looting and peacefully protesting for about a portion, usually. It doesn't last too long. So it's all from different places. And this is like academia is one of the places where kids that are on the streets today have been brainwashed. They've also been sucked into the wrong ideology, but also the ideology and financial ideology of debt. I mean, a lot of these white protesters on the streets who are participating in these horrible things going on in, say, Portland, where they're just out of control, or have been taught, as I said, through brainwashing and especially institutes of higher learning with a communist agenda in mind, convincing them that violent protesting is an acceptable form of problem solving. Well, and then the lie that this was, people say, this is nothing but the Boston Tea Party today. This is what the Boston Tea Party people didn't come back and burn their city down. So the destruction, again, this is destructive. So we know it's not Western civilization inspired. This is another ideology. This is a destructive ideology. This is an ideology that you could say ends in the guillotine for everybody in the French Revolution. And there's just the big ones in the Russian Revolution, in the Maoist Revolution, in the Kim Jong-un Revolution, in the Cambodian quote-unquote revolution. None of these aren't revolutions. They're police state takeovers. But in each one of those, communism turned out very badly. Okay, very, very, very badly for a lot of people. And each one of those states was undermined for years by propaganda. 1905 in Russia were having Bloody Sunday. It took them another 10 to 12 years before this turned into complete mayhem. How did it possibly happen in a state like Russia at the time, or a state like France, in the state it was in? It's agitating, it's a plan, it's a dogma, it's brainwashing, it's pitting race against race and class against class. This isn't really a race war, as I say, because you've got white people killing white people and black people killing black people, and very little in between that they mention. But it can't be a race war, it's more of a class war at this point in time, because look who got rich during this coronavirus stuff, and look who's profiting off the rioting. Mail order places like Amazon. Jeez. But the average middle class guy is suffering right now. The businesses are being destroyed. The average American doesn't live in a gated community, doesn't have the protection. Of course, you've got them, different state governments working against you all the time to take away your last thing you do have, which is the right to protect yourself. So be careful of a few things here and there, and society can fall apart, which we've seen. And this isn't like this is totally widespread. I mean, unrest is. But I mean, can you imagine Portland in 20 cities instead of just one? Well, somebody better do something about that. Because if we take away our right to defend ourselves, we're in big trouble. But also, you have to remember you got to defend your brain too, which means read up, see what's going on, figure out who's voting. You got to become more involved. So now that sports has been pretty much ruined for a lot of people, they should spend that extra time where they don't want to turn on basketball and see rich players complaining about systemic racism or the hunting down and genocide of young black men by evil white cops. They should take that time they would have spent watching basketball or hockey or football and or even baseball, I hate to say, because they're putting it up on the mound and bowing down and everything else, and learn something. Learn about politics. Learn about what's going on. Don't just trust Fox or CNN. The truth is always somewhere between, although conservative news outlets seem to be doing a better job than liberal ones. But you got to get out there and read some books. That's why you should read a book about the French Revolution. That's why you should read The Naked Communists. And those books are at www.barnesreview.com. But you have to read them and understand them to really see what's going on, because history is repeating itself, as it always does.
And that is great advice, Paul. Everybody should check out www.barnesreview.org. Go to the bookstore, find out how you can lay your hands on a copy of this tremendous September-October issue of the Barnes Review magazine. We are out of time, but we will be back again, same time, same place next week. Until then, from all of us here at TBR Radio, God bless.